So, exploring the crisis. So we're going to talk today about some of the projects that myself and Sam with others have been completing since 2019, 2020, so 5 years of work and consultation. And we're rolling them all together. There you go. We've got some pictures. This is just a false idea that there's going to be lots of pictures because actually loads of words. So enjoy this while you can. So we're going to talk mainly about 3 projects. Options for Sustainable Archives, that was funded by HE with ACE, as Claire mentioned. And then we've got Options Appraisal for Costing Models and the NCAA Muser and Research and Needs project. Myself and Sam have worked with Quinton Carroll, Sally Croft, Justin Wells at Cambridge for the first project. Then with Sally Croft in the Cost Models project and Jenny Durant. So I just want to say thank you for those guys. They're not here today, but they really contributed hugely to the development of this package of work. Each project has explored a very specific aspect of the issue that we've been talking about, adding depth to that understanding of the crisis itself and enhancing the picture of what was needed in terms of solutions. The scoping exercise has enabled discussions of how people across the sector feel about these proposals, which is really important in terms of both the cost and the model, so how it's set up, and then how it will be then implemented. In this paper, we're going to explore the recommendations that we've made in terms of what a national collection might be, and then share the insights from those consultations. We're not going to go too much into detail about the proposals. We're going to leave that to Barney at the end. But really, we just want to show that collation of all the data we've been gathering over the years. In terms of finding a solution, the overall message from our consultation was pretty clear. Hasn't changed yet, though. It will be really clear. That we know what the challenge is. We looked over desk-based research for 10 years of projects, starting in 2012 with Rachel Edwards' work. We know what the challenge is, and we've all known it for a long time. The problem... Can it roll on to the next slide? It's not doing it. There we go. We understand the challenge. The problem is still there. We still need to address it, and it's about more than just boxes. Discussions led to the conclusion that a nationally coordinated process or a brand for archaeological archives could provide an umbrella under which a consistent, standardised approach to the preparation, storage, and importantly, access to archives could sit. People felt that a solution should seize that opportunity to create both a physical national repository to solve some of that crisis, but also to provide a digitally accessible index or register, not an archive, where those archive contents could be accessible so you could find and access that information. The idea of the on to the next one. The idea of the National Collection for Archaeological Archives started to form through these discussions. And the vision really is that the NCAA itself would provide that centralised web-based catalogue and index, making the archaeological archives findable and accessible, that nod to FAIR, which is really important, using standardised forms and including legacy data. That there are a base level of standards for the preparation and deposition, simplifies operations for contractors across England. We heard that loud and clear, and created a more efficient, more cost-effective system. A single point of online access for archive creators, curators, and users provides a substantial research opportunity, and the ability of local museums to join and become part of the NCAA allows a continuing of collection within regional repositories. Although there needs to be an agreement to meet standards of access and to link data into that infrastructure of NCAA so that it can work. An underpinning collection policy for NCAA would be driven by and linked to regional research frameworks where archaeological fieldwork continues to enhance that collection. And that approach will be collaborative and include creators in its strategic aims, as well as the monitoring organisations and the curatorial teams that will continue to use it. Overall, the NCAA would also be supported by a distributed team of archives advisors, providing that regional support to both promote and engage with NCAA and giving a connection between the existing repositories and the individual central store, as well as archive collectors, hosts, users and stakeholders. So this was the vision, and this was the conclusion of the Options project.
Okay, so the next project was the cost models project. And this is going to be a very brief roundup. As we've said, all the reports are out there if you want the actual details. So in exploring the feasibility of the NCAA, an important aspect was to review the income and how sustainably we could drive that income. So by understanding an options review, we explored the cost models which could underpin a national archive. And initially, this project involved detailed cost analysis of over 250 projects from contracting units across the country who provided real project data on the overall cost of the project, the cost to deposit that project, and how the size of that deposition as well. So I'd like to say once again thank you to all the units who supplied that data, because it was absolutely fascinating and invaluable. The results were really revealing. It indicated a severe disproportionality of deposition costs, with smaller projects costing twice as much to deposit as larger ones when defined as a percentage of the overall project cost. And when we applied current real-world deposition costs to these real-world projects, the deposition of smaller projects, so under 10k, was around 10% of the overall project costs, whereas larger projects, it was between 1.45 and 1.82%. So this illustrated the current system favours larger projects when it comes to the cost of their deposition and results in disproportionality in the way we cost our projects. It also suggested, when you compare the data, that we are not adequately costing for the deposition of our archives at the outset of projects, or we're not really being honest about what those costs, genuine costs, are or could be when it comes to speaking with our with developers and with our clients. So we undertook a review of national, regional and collection-based cost models, which confirmed that when a charging structure is in place, it's generally a box charge. But all the case study respondents emphasised that this model did not cover the full cost of archiving, collections care or provisional access. And we therefore looked at options designed to sustainably support a national approach, and we needed to consider all those models in the current climate and speak to all the relevant stakeholders and parties that work within this system. So we ran a series of rapid SWOT assessment workshops, and we delivered these with heritage practitioners across the sector, so archaeological project managers, consultants, planning archaeologists, HCR officers, and these are just some of the SWOT analysis. As I said, you can find the report. There's way too much detail to go into today. Oh, just a second. I seem to have missed a page. I need to read it because there's just too much specific detail to not. So while the project didn't intend to identify a winning cost model, the consultation was able to identify broad support for realistic, clear and fair models. And our conclusions were that any sustainable cost model should guarantee public benefit through the long-term preservation, management and access to archaeological archives. And that really any cost model that was agreed upon across the sector must reflect the overall impact of development on archaeological work and enhance the public benefit of cultural heritage through curation, dissemination and access of archaeological archives. It should be based on proportional fee, which is identified and ring-fenced securely during project delivery, so it's not missing by the time that archive deposition happens. It should make a significant contribution to generate a sustainable model for curation and access, including the skills needed to facilitate this, and not just boxes on shelves, but people as well. And it should support the existing repository network and potential increases in capacity and access to archaeological archives in England. So that was a very quick roundup. And then, in order to put this in its picture and to really understand how this would land within the sector, we move on to the user needs and operating models consultation, which was the final project we undertook at the start of last year. As Claire has previously outlined, the Future for Archaeological Archives programme comprises multiple projects exploring aspects of the crisis, as well as proposals and recommendations. And a key area of that research has been to explore the concept and the vision of the NCAA from the perspective of its users, specifically museums and researchers who might be the beneficiaries of this proposal. The project also explored how different operating models would land within the sector. And you can read a lot more detail in the reports, I keep saying. So a user needs exercise was delivered between February and March 2024. It was a 2-month consultation, so it was quite short and quite compact, but we did engage over 60 museum professionals, researchers and relevant organisations. I'm just going to show you some of them quickly. So an initial stakeholder mapping exercise ensured that the project team were able to identify any consultation gaps and make sure we spoke to as broad a cross-spectrum of the sector as we could. And this image just shows some of those partners and people were identified as collection partners, users and beneficiaries, so archive creators, museums and repositories, universities, researchers, volunteers and members of the public. In addition, we considered interfaces such as ongoing projects, relationships to professional standards, platforms, organisations and policymakers. And the consultation process was designed to reach as much of this board as possible, but we did have a short time frame to work within. So we did focus on two key audiences, which was museums and researchers, but around those we did speak to other stakeholders such as funding bodies and people might affect those decisions. And the group of individuals and organisations contacted directly numbered around 95, with communications also supported by people like SMA, UA UK and CIFA, and in total 61 individuals or organisations responded to the consultation. And we did lots of one-to-one interviews, really in-depth one-to-one interviews, surveys, and we invited all the participants to partake in workshops and SWOT analysis. And I'm going to hand over to Manda, who's going to talk through the cost model feedback that we got through this process.
So before we started doing our in-depth consultation, we needed something to consult about in terms of what the NCAA could actually look like, because that was a lot of the questions we'd be having in previous phases of the project. We spoke to a number of the organisations. If you put your minds back to the slide you just saw, the blue column there, a lot of those organisations actually represented different operating models. So, for example, we spoke to Collections Trust, we spoke to CBA, the Postal Museum, towards a national collection. So we got a really good roundup. And ADS, just in Katie, very useful conversation with Katie. So we spoke to a lot of people about how they operate and the benefits and challenges that they might find through those operating models. And then we came up with 5 different models, which we felt were kind of realistic about how something of this scale could actually operate. I'm not going to go through every single option in detail. Again, reports are available, but we're just going to look at the feedback that we received against the 3 with the green stars there. One element of the consultation considered how each of these models were viewed by those different audiences, because that was felt to be a really important response to how this might work or be received by our sector. One-to-one interviews with existing organisations which use these models meant that we could kind of go into those conversations with a better understanding of what they actually mean on a day-to-day basis. And as well as those initial interviews, we also did another rapid SWOT analysis, and then we went on to the larger consultation with those wider audience groups. Option 1, adjunct to an existing public body. So that would be linked to or part of an arm's length body. Yeah, it's up there. This has emerged as one that was most aligned with the core proposition that we had in terms of a national collection. Key advantages to this would include the potential for longer term investment stability and national advocacy power, and that it could achieve something like independent research organisation status, so it could open up funding streams, for example, to UKRI. Stakeholders describe this as the right model in an ideal world, and this could either join an existing ALB or form a new one. So an ARB is something like Historic England, for example, or the British Museum. Forming a new one would then transcend existing perceptions and sectoral boundaries. So that was another option that came out of our chats. It was seen of having the appropriate gravitas to resource something that we were talking about as national cultural value. Option 2, the independent charitable trust, another common model, was again received well, as it showed an independence from those host bodies. It would be something that could stand on its own 2 feet, and that was seen as a key advantage. The benefits would be its charitable status, meaning it would have business rates relief, for example, gift aid, VAT exemption, and it could potentially access grants and develop trading subsidiaries to build new income revenue streams. Also eligible for IRA status, The added advantage would be that it would be open to ACE national portfolio funding, so another national funding stream could be used. However, this model was perceived as being very vulnerable by most stakeholders we spoke to, particularly regarding its financial stability. We've all heard of problems that charitable trusts are having in our sector. There are governance requirements that can be problematic in terms of time and flexibility, but that was seen as both a strength and a weakness, and measures would be needed to protect the collection in case of organisational failure. But examples like the Postal Museum, for example, has 2 trusts which are structured in a way to entirely protect that collection as well. So a lot of the problems that were raised, actually, there are existing solutions around them. The final one was our kind of wild card, if you think about location. The research institution independently funded by UKRI came up through a number of those conversations, including one with UKRI. And this model really generated significant interest in the conversations that followed, especially in the research community. So the major benefit here was its ability to transcend the silos that we perceive to exist within our sector, but also its ability to support the existing infrastructure for regional museums, as well as that kind of newly developed element of a central store. It's perceived to be less susceptible to externally imposed change as against other models, but not necessarily more financially secure, because it would need that funding. Many consultees were less familiar with this model in terms of how it would work in its implementation, but recognise the strong potential for emphasising knowledge and that kind of research value of the archaeological archives. What actually came up was that one single operating model wasn't the winner, as we would probably expect with this sort of work. But actually, there were lots of common concerns and areas of interest that were shared by the stakeholders and the users as well. So stakeholders generally supported the concept of the NCAA while expressing some caution around its implementation. And that caution was within every one of those operating models, so it didn't link itself to one particular one. Archaeological archives were viewed by everybody as underutilised and as a massive resource for the country that could benefit research and public benefit. So everybody's on the same page in terms of how important this is and to find a solution. But generally, stakeholders preferred a distributed approach that supports local collections rather than an entirely central model. Financial sustainability was a concern for everybody with every model, but it's a concern for all of us pretty much every day, I imagine, so that wasn't a surprise. But government support was felt to be essential for almost all of the models that were provided, apart from the fully commercial model, but everybody had concerns about that, so it wasn't necessarily the solution. An optimal approach, therefore, would probably combine all of these elements from the multiple models to give national leadership, research profile, cross-sector collaboration, existing capabilities and diversification of those income streams, including both commercial fees and fundraising. So there you go. Thank you. Next to what people
and as part of this project, as we've already said, we spoke directly to lots of people. If you press play, at least people can see some photos. So it's not just words. So as we said, we spoke to 2 major groups, which was museums and researchers. And for the museum researcher user needs consultation, we spoke to museums that currently collect archaeological archives, that no longer collect archaeological archives, those that have never collected them. I'm going to say archaeological archives a lot, I'm sorry. And where no archaeological archive repository exists at all. And while some generalisations can be drawn from repositories, responses when from differing types of collecting institutions, they're not clear-cut. Also, views expressed depended on the individuals involved, the history of that collecting institution, external pressures that they experience, and the governance and financial structures which those museums and individuals operate. We asked some key questions with regard to our museums that were taking part. So what are the opportunities and challenges identified by existing repositories and museums on the concept of a national collection? What kind of access to archives held in a central store might be required for those museums, which otherwise would have held this material more locally? And what are the pros and cons of the different business operating models, which Manda's already gone through, and that kind of surrounded all of our discussions. I'm just going to present some of the themes that came out now. Oh, sorry, I'll get rid of the nice pictures, I'm afraid. But these, as I said, these are quite generalised. There is a lot of nuance. There is a lot of detail. There's a lot of specifics that came out of all these differing institutions. We cannot possibly cover all that today, but you can find it all in a very, very large report. So in general, museums that are currently closed to the deposition of archaeological archives were strongly in favour of a national solution. The proposed national collection was considered an opportunity to solve the issue of undepositable archives within their collecting area, and with the potential to transform how archaeological archives are produced, accessed and curated. Several respondents were very keen to highlight, however, that there are many geographical areas and collecting institutions where the current archaeological archive deposition and curation is functioning really well, and that any national solution should not supersede or nullify this provision. And though the consultation with museums, it didn't come out with any defining results, as Manda said, but it did come out with some key themes that are really important when we consider taking this forward. So changes to existing collection practices and what that might bring. So museums that currently close to archaeological depositions strongly favour a national solution to manage the undepositable archives and transform access. Benefits included digital access, expertise sharing and maintaining decision-making involvement. Even museums with collection capacity could see a value in national infrastructure. Many museums viewed a national repository as an opportunity to create space by transferring complete or partial archives. Options did vary on the splitting of collections between central and local storage, although many museums saw this as compatible with normal museum practices. Though they could, so like retaining exhibition-worthy items, loans and transfers, and while transferring out material that they found less useful to their day-to-day practices. But museums did express significant concerns about integrating with a proposed national archaeological archive system. They report that the necessary changes to collection practices aren't currently scheduled or funded, therefore requiring additional resources for data management, cataloguing and decision-making about transfers. And they indicated that any proposed national collection would need to fund these essential management tasks as existing governance and financial structures lack capacity. Each institution's ability to implement change is further complicated by their specific governance arrangements that they individually experience. So financial structures. Museums that currently don't collect archaeological archives didn't really perceive any changes to financial structures as an issue, as they're not currently benefiting from the deposition fee, and their curatorial roles were not reliant on this income. This view was also the case for those collecting museums where archaeological archives formed only like a small part of their provision, or where deposition fees were not linked to staffing or resources. However, there were concerns about the impact on existing provision when it came to finances. Concerns were raised around the impact the potential national collection could have on those museums and institutions that currently collect archaeological archives, and several museums expressed challenges they are currently facing due to pressures on council budgets and local authority finances. And some museums did suggest that if a national provision was seen as cheaper or easier option by local councils, that they could choose to just transfer the requirement to the national solution, to the national collection, and remove it from museum functioning. When it came to ownership, most respondents concluded they would prefer ownership of archaeological archives from their collecting areas to be held within their museum, regardless of their physical location, the storage location. The responses of this were varied and included complexities of the deaccessioning and disposal process, ability to access and use the archives for exhibitions engagement, and recording researcher engagement as a reportable metric. Many museums considered the transfer of archives could be managed through the current loan system and still retain ownership of them. But quite a few did raise concerns about who would make the decisions about the use of the material which was held centrally, so as in was not within their own stores. These concerns included who would manage and approve the research process, who would approve the loan process, who would make decisions about access and collection care priorities, who would make conservation decisions, destructive analysis decisions, who would approve access to human remains, and really importantly, who would monitor and document those resulting activities, those documents and reportings that is part of normal museum life. Who would take on that responsibility and how would it be fed back to them? All museums and collecting institutions and local authorities representative voiced clear opinions that decisions around the selection and retention of archaeological material could only be made at the local level by people who understood local and regional collecting and research priorities. This opinion was unanimous, regardless of the current policy on archive deposition, if they would like to retain ownership of their archaeological archives, or if ownership would pass to the national collection. They all felt those decisions should still remain locally. When it came to standardisation of practices, most museums considered standardisation of the creation and deposition process to have advantages for all involved. However, some concerns were raised about the mapping of new national standards onto existing museum practices, and this included the standardisation of the dreaded box sizes if a national collection had one, and the resources required to support and changes to their own internal processes and systems. A few museums raised concerns over how national standards would be agreed at that level, who would be making this decision and in what manner. And they also stated that any requirements of existing best practice standards for archive deposition should not be reduced if these national standards came into play. In general, many responders would consider sending material to a national collection. They weren't really worried about what state it would be held in, because they would assume that would be up to current best practice standards, though they would obviously like to see that written down and confirmed. They emphasised that the requirements of existing best practice standards for collections, curation and care, such as the Museum Association standards, they shouldn't be reduced. And one respondent saw the opportunity for national collection to improve sectoral standards and practices across the country. So as we see, it's very varied, and pluses and negatives on all sides of the argument. They did see that the NCAA, the proposed NCAA, could offer significant potential to support and encourage academic research, and they thought this would easily happen through the online data store. But some of them did question whether splitting of material, if that happened between a national collection and local repositories, could that in some way limit some of the academic research that could take place specifically by local researchers. They did acknowledge that access to information about archaeological holdings across England had the potential to improve and enhance their exhibition and engagement activities. So, for example, a responder from a small museum saw the potential for the proposed national collection to enable wider engagement with archaeological collections by museums that had no current involvement with commercial archaeology and no potential to become involved in the future. Access to detailed archaeological object information through an online data store and facilitation of loans, transfers and transport of objects was considered to have the potential to encourage braver archaeology exhibitions. So as one curator put it, in terms of archaeology exhibitions, if you think about it, the national museums do quite exciting and innovative exhibitions. These things aren't really open to the local regional museums at the moment. However, the NCAA could give regional museums the opportunity to think much bigger and think about putting on much braver exhibitions. Oh, have we? Okay, I'll be quick. What was it? The location. They thought archaeological archives, where possible, should remain locally, but where there is no other solution, a national repository was the only way forward. Go.
Okay, so the second key audience was our researcher audience, and that included not only university-based researchers, but researchers in practice as well. So we kind of widened that to as many people as we could. We had two key questions. What are the benefits and opportunities? What level of access needs to be sought by universities and other researchers? And what would the advantages and disadvantages of that approach be? When it comes to finding collections online, current access challenges were raised as quite an important point in terms of people struggling to find where material exists and then what it is, as well as finding that that access relies heavily on personal connections and word of mouth, and that digital access has huge potential to just knowing where things are and what's in those collections, and that would significantly help both early career researchers as well as established researchers, dramatically reducing time spent trying to just find what it is that you're looking for. In terms of physical access, the current system has that kind of hit and miss about it in terms of responses, and that's to do with capacity, I think, in probably all museums. That under-resourcing is a critical factor, and many museums lack an understanding of what's in the boxes, not what's in the collection as a whole, but that kind of detail of what's in the boxes and the bags within that. There would be an impact on research quality, and that the current system leads research to be based on access rather than importance and knowing what's there. And that there are concerns, however, about charging access fees and how the national collection might impact that. Researchers often pay, for example, from their own pockets for access to travel, accommodation and those sorts of things. There's always a concern about an unintended weakening of regional museums as well, which runs through all the responses to these themes. In terms of location, no clear consensus, of course, because everybody would like it to be near them. But there are geographic barriers to access that are important to consider. Things like overnight stays, for example, add huge costs to things. And there are preferred solutions in terms of that distributed model, so people can access in a more green way, actually. That's what came through in terms of travel being a really important point to think about. And longevity and leadership was another area that was really important to people in terms of both environmental leadership, environmental sustainability, financial sustainability, and continuity concerns. Sam, recommendations.
Really quickly, so from this user needs, we recommended that there needs to be a much more detailed and there needs to be a much more detailed long-term consultation with all parties across the sector, and needs to be based on really clear outlines for what the national collection can be, because a lot of the work we've done so far has been based on, quite frankly, an idea or a best case or what we proposed. So people want to know genuinely what they're responding to. Any decisions need to be really transparent, and they need to be centered around the existing ecosystem of regional museums. As Manda said, that's really clear. Whatever it happens shouldn't reduce the current provision or impact on that provision in any way, and so that any future work really needs to work within that system and make sure that the benefits are felt throughout it.
And then finally, because those recommendations obviously can't be overly specific on what actually happens, we actually pulled out some underpinning principles that we felt were really important to all the people we spoke to in terms of that shared national resource, having research interest and collection use that will allow a range of professionals and a diversity of disciplines to actually benefit from the collection, a collaborative model which recognises regional and national approaches, a national collection rooted in the concept of a distributed model which unifies collections across England, and that it should seek to improve and maintain the care, curation and use of those collections, as well as striving for social, financial and environmental sustainability, seeking to minimise impact on the environment. And finally, the last sentence, in summary, the proposed NCAA presents a huge opportunity to address a substantial and critical issue in England's archaeological sector, while supporting England's regional museums and existing repositories. Thank you.